Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about product quality. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how do dedicated development teams ensure better product quality? Well, I suspect that at least the ones that I've worked with, first and foremost, they have enough interest in their profession and in their system to actually want to do well, to build the best system that they can build. That is probably number one. And that usually manifests itself by one part, of course, that they have the technical skills. That's the first thing. We're going to talk a little bit about a few practices that I usually say that they are following as well. But I think that the main thing when it comes to product quality is that they understand the problem that they are trying to solve and they understand what they will need to do in order to deliver on the goals of that project. That is, well, basically product mindedness, product mindset. And that is something that is rare. It's rare, rare, rare in the software development teams. Most software developers have no thought whatsoever into the quality of their system and like the solutions that they are building and things like that. My favorite example of this is actually like I'm actually putting together some learning materials for a few of my teams today where I'm trying to teach them this thing where and these are backend developers. So one of the things that I usually see when I work with a lot of backend development teams is that if you look at their API documentation, it is shit and usually incorrect and not up to date or things like that. And so what I try to teach them is that if you can get some product mindedness into API documentation and how you structure your APIs, your overall system quality will actually go up. Imagine yourself, like how many times have you felt frustrated over somebody else's API integration or having to integrate to doing, like my favorite one is like OAuth systems or things like that for various API providers and so forth. And if their documentation is like a little bit iffy, it's pretty hard to work with that thing. It's almost frustrating to you. But when you are in the same situation, when you are a provider where you usually take the path of least resistance for yourself, which is being a little bit lazy, just I guess the worst culprit here is .NET developers. Holy shit, using Swashbuckle and just auto-generating everything and so forth. It's super, super convenient for you, but it's also pretty tricky for any consumer if you make a breaking change or anything like that to actually figure out that you did do that breaking change and so forth and so forth. And then, of course, most API developers usually just like they don't really think about interfaces and things like that. But when they do these things, when they start thinking about, okay, so how would a really nice API work, for example? Well, that actually actually flows into how well do you design the entire API. Like because you're not trying to think about just shipping a feature. You're trying to think about, okay, how can I fit this feature into this very nice product? UI developers or front-end developers, it's a very similar sort of thing, where if they need to create something new, the focus isn't necessarily to just make that new thing fit. The focus is to a little bit like a puzzle, to take a new puzzle piece and say, okay, so how can I attach that and still have a nice puzzle, like have the overall thing still work? That's the mindfulness of like product development that I argue that the really dedicated developers have, because they actually want their system to be a really good system. They're not. That's the focus. The focus is to build a good system, not to make sure that, well, like that you ship as quickly as humanly possible, or like the focus isn't to just do the minimum amount of work. You have to have a little bit of passion in order to make a really good system. The basic, like the practicalities, those that usually comes back to having skill. Like dedicated development teams usually have a bit of skill to leverage, because otherwise they wouldn't really be all that dedicated, if you ask me. Or maybe they could be dedicated and still have no skill. Like that is up for discussion. But in order to improve their product quality, usually they care about testing. They care about doing good pull requests and code reviews and things like that, and having some way of following the basic practices. And that's what I've said 100 times before, guys. Like 80% of product quality, if you think in terms of just the code itself, is covered by basic practices. Now, a lot of software developers may not necessarily know of all the various ways and so forth, because there are advanced ways of doing it. But I mean, when I do, for example, workshops these days with senior level software developers, it's not like I have to this day never had to have a workshop with developers where they had a system where they really needed to get some coaching or something like that on, say, load testing or accessibility testing, even though that might have been something that can be pretty good in some situations. But usually it's not these more sophisticated things that the teams are trying to do. Like, and I usually don't preach all that much about more advanced forms of testing, like property-based testing, and there are tons of various systems for testing various things, right, for very specific niche cases. But most of the time, I find that if I can get the teams to just make sure that they understand how to reason, because that's the thing that I usually focus on. And I think that is the biggest tip I can give anybody who wants to raise their overall product quality in any team, if we're excluding the product mindedness and just focusing on the tech itself. And that is to teach your developers what test to write for what situation. That is the biggest tip I can give you, because basically quite a lot of software developers are either not writing tests or things like that, and they're not, or if they are, they're usually not reflecting so much about why they are writing a test. So what I try to explain to people is that even if you have all the tests that you can think of, that doesn't necessarily mean that the system is working. Because if you don't understand that the test's purpose is to validate that a part of your system is working, and that then you have to really make sure that you understand that part, and then you have to pick the test that will best tell you if the thing is working. That is a mindset, or that is a way for you to, like, it's I have that workshop running now actually with the front-end developers, where I'm trying to teach them the basic about the testing pyramid, for example. And I've constructed a few exercises where I know for a fact that if they try to just use something like Cypress or like an end-to-end test runner, they're not going to be able to do this. And if they only use unit testing, like Jest, in this case it's React and so forth, they're also not going to be able to do it. There's a layer, because there are multiple elements and multiple layers of the application that will have issues of their own. A classic one that I usually say for UI things, it's almost always, you at the bare minimum, you're going to need a unit test and a visual regression test, because there's a UI element to it. So like styling and stuff like that can be off. And if you understand these sort of purposes, like these different application areas of various types of testing, well, then usually the quality is, like, as I said, like, it's super, super easy to get high quality, assuming now that you know what you're doing as a software developer. And I've never seen it fail. As long as those basics for, doesn't matter if it's back and front and so forth, like if the developers are writing their unit test, integration test, or visual regression test, and some basic end-to-end testing, depending on the situation, right? They're actually making sure that they do that really well, and they ask the right relevant questions, and they really try to think about the overall health of the system and how features come in and how they do work and so forth. They have a product mindedness, and like they really think about what their end customer would really like for their API or their UI and so forth, to try and think about the user experience of the consumer of their system. When they do those two parts, I have never seen a problem with quality whatsoever. At least nothing that team can be responsible for. Like maybe some other part of the system, like a third-party integration or something like that, causes issue, but the team itself is like, nobody's ever complained to them, as far as I know. So what I want you to take away from this is that dedicated development teams, how they ensure product quality, is usually two things. Get your basics of testing. Make sure that you understand what type of system have you built, what types of testing will you need to do in order to make sure that it's easy to make sure that every new feature is working, and that, like, take a look at the testing pyramid. It's basically, it's the best representation of this. It's not necessarily the quantities, like how much of every test you are writing. It's more about understanding that some parts of your system will need a unit test, some will need an integration test, some will need a UI test. You don't have to like be all or nothing here. It has to do with understanding the various layers of the application that you have built, and what each area of these layers, like what can go wrong, and understanding which type of test would be best to write to make sure that that doesn't happen, for example. Those are the basics, and you don't have to do very fancy things here. Like most of, like, if you're doing unit testing, basic integration testing, and say visual regression testing or something like that for a UI application or stuff like that, and maybe one or two end-to-end tests depending on system and so forth, that's, you're good. Like, learn those things really, really well, and I promise you your quality will go up like to a really, really high level just based on that. And then the other part is, of course, make sure that you understand your business, understand the system that you're building, understand the people who are going to use that system, and make sure that when you build new things, don't just plug out and just ship whatever on the story card. Make sure that you understand that, okay, so I have these people, they need these features, this story is about this, and so forth. How does that fit into my project? And if something seems a little bit off, just ask. You don't have to say to people that they're wrong or so forth and so forth. Just try to ask, okay, we're asked to do this thing here, but our customers really care about this. Are we sure that that's what we want to do? Have a conversation with the people who are going to use your system, just a little bit. And that product mindedness, that's especially true. I mean, if you take a look at ourselves, like our own, we software developers, I mean, imagine how horribly most of the really big open source projects would do if they never talked to any of us software developers. Like, they would build a bunch of different systems for people, but nobody, I mean, think about it yourself. How many times have you been able to ship a library or like a reusable function or something like that everybody else just loved? It's really hard to do. So you really have to really know your customer. In this case, that's other software developers, as I was saying with API design and so forth. Most people hate other people's APIs, but if you want to be the exception to the rule, the best thing is to think, okay, what type of API would I like? What features should my API have? And like the people who are going to use it, maybe I'll check in with them. I show them like a specification or something like that and see if they like it. If you just do that, you're automatically going to build something better than if you just, look at the list of specification and then just implement it without thinking about who's going to use it. Have a great day.